Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's LinkedIn Live. My name's Aneta Gell, and I am Quality Operations and Training Manager at Paul R. Palmer Limited. And today we are going to talk about technical agreements, specifically why so many of them look perfectly reasonable when they are signed and then completely fail or fall apart at the moment that you need them. I'm going to share with you some real situations that I have encountered, situations where the gaps in quality agreement caused genuine operational and regulatory problems. And none of them are theoretical, and all of them were avoidable. Because this is LinkedIn Live, I won't be able to hear your questions or comments directly during the session. So please leave any comments or any questions you may have in the comment section, and I will come back to you after the session. Or you can reach me directly at anettagel@pqs.ltd. Let me start with the situation that I would like you to picture, because it is far more common than it should be. A company sources a starting material, which a contract manufacturer then uses to produce an API, active pharmaceutical ingredient. And one of the starting materials that comes in fails incoming QC at the contract site. A straightforward enough situation, you could say, except that the contract manufacturer, the API side, then says this is not their responsibility to contact the supplier and to do anything with the material. You need to sort it out. And when you, as the owner, look at the quality agreement, you find out that there is nothing there to guide you of who is responsible for what, because the clause covering API and raw materials management is vague, that nobody, not the owner, not the CMO, can point a single sentence that would resolve the question you have. And that's the moment when a quality agreement fails. So not when it was signed, not during an audit, but during a practical operational moment under pressure, when a decision needs to be made and the document that should guide that decision is silent. The example came from an agreement that had the starting materials clause in. It just didn't say anything useful, really. It said responsibilities would be agreed, but it didn't say what they were. And of course, they didn't get agreed in specific detail. This is what a vague language will cost you, not just the frustration that you will get because you think your quality agreement will provide you with the answers, which it doesn't. It costs time. It may cost you your time slot in the production schedule. It may cost you the overall product because of how the timings are set up. And in some cases, it can cost you the relationship with your CMO and the regulators, who reasonably expect you to have these things sorted out. The question I would like to address today is, what does quality agreement actually need to say so when that moment comes, it can really back you up? Okay, so before we go into any content, let's have a look what the quality agreement actually is. So quality agreement is a comprehensive written GMP document. It is a living document. It should be version controlled and reviewed on a given cycle and signed by a quality unit on both sides. It is a statement of who does what across your GMP activities within the scope of the agreement. And it is something a regulator may well look at during an inspection. And importantly, it should be separate from any commercial contract. Now that we know what it is, let's have a look at what it isn't. It isn't a way to transfer your GMP liability. US FDA says this explicitly in their 2016 guidance for technical agreements, and EU GMP Chapter 7 says the same thing. Each party remains independently responsible for the activity it performs. You cannot assign away your regulatory exposure, no matter how carefully the agreement is worded. And you, as the owner, are ultimately responsible and accountable for your contractors and your CMOs if they fail. It is not a substitute for a qualified person certification responsibility. In EU and UK settings, the QP certifies every batch. Outsourcing activities don't change that. The agreement needs to support your QP ability to certify. It does not replace that. Very important. It's not a one-time document. I've seen agreements that were written at the start of the contract or a relationship with the CMO, and that they were not touched for years. If things run well, nobody bothers to review and update it. But the relationship does change, the products change, the subcontractors were added or removed. Systems that you use have changed, and the agreement still describes the world that you had when you initially signed your agreement. So it doesn't reflect reality. And this is not a quality agreement you can rely on. It seems a nuisance to keep reviewing it and updating the contract when there is no crisis. But this quality agreement with the updated contact and updated content is there for the crisis. So it's there when you need it. It's just like you pay car insurance because you don't want to be caught out when your car stops working in the middle of the trip. And of course, it's manageable to sort it out then, and it's not too late, but it is very difficult and it causes a lot of frustration, as I mentioned, and it can be very, very costly. It's not a place for commercial terms, the quality agreement, pricing, liability caps, delivery terms. These belong into your supply agreement. Keep them out of the quality agreement matters, and you'll see why in the moment. Okay, let's have a quick look at the regulatory landscape. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the framework does matter. So in the US, the FDA November 2016 guidance is the primary reference for technical agreement. The core message is that responsibilities must be defined clearly, not left implied or ambiguous. Each party is independently liable for activity it performs. In the EU, EudraLex Volume 4, Chapter 7, which covers all outsourced GMP activities, not just manufacturing, but testing, packaging, storage, and distribution depend on what is outsourced. The contract giver retains ultimate responsibility, and the contract acceptor cannot subcontract without prior evaluation and written approval. And these are not suggestions, these are requirements. ICHQ 10 frames outsourcing as part of the pharmaceutical quality system. The owner must control outsourced activities. The owner must assess contractor suitability before engaging and then monitor the performance throughout the relationship. ICHQ 7 covers APIs and contract laboratory testing specifically. PICS tracks the EU GMP Chapter 7 very closely and is relevant for most non-EU markets. So if you are working across multiple geographies, the same expectations will apply. And You can see the vocabulary can be different. The FDA talks about owners and contract facilities. The EU talks about contract givers and contract acceptors. But the underlying principle is the same in all of them. You need a written, agreed, controlled arrangements for every outsourced GMP activity. And the responsibilities need to be specified clearly enough to be usable. Okay, now let's talk about where agreements break down. And I want to use a real example here because it will nicely illustrate one of these weaknesses that you can see on your screen. So I was involved in a situation where a contract manufacturer was involved in the production of a single product. CMO1 manufactured the product. CMO2 packaged it and released it to market. And CMO3 manufactured the API. Each of them had a separate quality agreement with the owner, but the three agreements were not aligned with each other, which in a way we didn't know until we come across an issue. So CMO2, which is the CMO that did the packaging and release to market, the qualified persons requested that under the Annex 16, they need to see that we audit all the subcontractors, and they wanted to see the audit report. The CMO3, the API manufacturer, refused to allow the owner to share the audit report. And because it has never been agreed in quality agreement that the sharing was permitted. The CMO needed the information because it is the legal requirement for them to be in compliance as a releasing site. But the CMO position was that they would have to come and audit them if they wanted an audit report. Of course, the owner was thinking, how do we solve this? Can we do a confidentiality agreement? But of course, that is a timely process because everybody wants to use their own template. If you don't use your own template, you have to get your legal team to review the template. That takes time, and the time's running. You have an out of stock situation developing. Your CMO tool, which is your packaging CMO and releasing CMO, is starting to threaten. They will not release anything. They will not continue packaging of your product, and you are continually supplying them with bulk product that needs to be packaged. So when you look at this slide and you think about the weaknesses, you can see them in the context. So the scope of the quality agreements didn't cover multi-party audit report process. The responsibility for what information flows between parties was completely absent. We had 3 quality agreements, but they were all for the CMOs or for the contractors that were very connected. But the quality agreements were not connected. They were not aligned in what was expected from each party. So the agreement existed, but they of course were not aligned, and they didn't reflect the operational reality of the supply chain. And that is too vague to be enforceable, really. And that's what that looks like in practice, because it doesn't look like a bad agreement. It looks like a perfectly reasonable agreement that simply didn't anticipate that the situation, would like this would arise. And now let's have a look at the critical clauses where we see the actual breakdowns, apart from the quality agreements not being aligned and asking for the same thing when it comes to complicated supply chains. So let's go through the specific clauses in turn. Change control. This is where many agreements are weakest. And I will share an example with you that will illustrate this. This why. To have a change control clause that is strong and will withstand any issues, you need a tiered model, not just changes will be communicated appropriately. You need to define what is critical, what's notifiable, what the timelines are, and who decides whether a regulatory submission is required. Then we have deviations and OOSs. You need to define what categories, who categorizes the event, when the owner is notified, who investigates, and what it means for that batch. For out of specification specifically, the owner must be notified before any retesting begins, must have access to raw data, and must retain it for the disposition. An agreement that doesn't say this explicitly leaves every OOS event open to interpretation. Then we have data integrity, which many people would think why that needs to be covered in a quality agreement. But Alcoa Plus expectations need to be written down. They cannot be assumed. The owner's right to access audit trails and electronic records needs to be explicit. This becomes critical when an inspection comes, and the regulator will ask the owner to demonstrate how do they manage the data generated when it's not at their site. And then we come to the audit rights, which we've touched upon in my first example a little bit. And it connects us to that first situation. So the agreement must cover not just the right to audit, it must cover what happens to the audit report, who holds them, who can see them, whether they can be shared with other parties in the supply chain. And if that isn't written down, you end up exactly where we ended with our CMO2 QPs. They needed the information that they were entitled to, but there was no mechanism to get it. And of course, we couldn't supply it because we didn't have the mechanism to be able to say, yes, that was agreed, and we can do that. Then you have stabilities and annual product reviews. There is a pattern that I have seen regularly where an annual product review arrives, and then during the review, the owner discovers that there was a change control that was not communicated. And I'll come to that in a moment with an example. But in short, what it is that if the agreement doesn't define who generates the data, who compiles the review, and what triggers notification, these gaps will surface exactly at the wrong moment. An API as a starting material management. The starting material example from the opening slide is a direct result of this section being missing or unenforceable. Who approves the suppliers? Who conducts the incoming QC? And who contacts the supplier when something fails? And all of that needs to be in your agreement. Let's have a look at what a vague clause actually looks like in practice, because this is where you can see the real work of writing a quality agreement. So you can see in red that the weak version. The contract facility will notify the owner of any significant changes in a timely manner. This is almost word for word from a real agreement. And I'm sure you have all seen statements like that. It sounds very good and it causes a real problem. An owner received an annual product review of one of the products, and inside the annual product review there was a document, there was a change control that was documented. The change has been implemented, but the owner has not been told about it. And when the owner raised this with the CMO response was that they had followed the agreement. The agreement said inform the changes as appropriate. And of course, in their view, the particular change didn't require owner notification. There is added complication here, because if you, the owner, and you are a small client with that particular CMO, then you are not producing high volumes. And in practice, CMO then start treating as appropriate as meaning for the clients that matter most to us operationally, we will inform them. But the clients that are lower on the list, they don't need to be informed. And the owner has no leverage because the agreement gave them none. You didn't have it specified in your agreement, you can't fight or stand your ground. The word appropriate is not a timeline, significant is not a category, and timely is not a clock. These words feel safe when you write in an agreement because they seem flexible and reasonable, but they are only flexible in one direction, and that is in the favor of the party that decides what they mean, and it's generally not in your direction when you are the owner and there is an issue that needs to be sorted out. The strong version on the right in green removes all the ambiguity. The Tier 1 changes require written approval before implementation. Tier 2 changes require notification at least 60 days in advance. And then the owner has the right to escalate to Tier 1 within that window. The owner owns the regulatory submission decision. None of this is complicated. It just needs to be written down. As you can see, simple process, and in that way, you manage your change control process, and your CMO shouldn't have an issue with that. The change never got communicated. Under this clause, it would have been caught, because if it was Tier 1, that would have needed approval. If it was Tier 2, it would have required a notification. So you would have learned about it in either case. So the quality agreement would have done its job. So responsibility matrix, the most used part of any quality agreement. I know that's what I used to do. You go to your table at the back of your quality agreement to see, who's responsible for that when there is an issue. The table you can see covers some of the most critical activities. You've got the master batch record approval, you've got the executed batch record review and a final release, QP certification, supplier qualification, and others. Every one of those has a clear single owner, and that is what you are aiming for. You don't want to have a line in your responsibility where you have both. If you have both, you need to define what they are, what they are responsible for. So what is contract giver responsible for, and what is contract acceptor responsible for. Now, let me connect this back to the starting material example, from earlier. And then in that situation, the incoming QC failure occurred and nobody knew who should contact the supplier. If you look at the row of qualifying raw materials suppliers, in that agreement, it was probably marked as both with no further explanation, or it wasn't in the matrix at all. And if you put both and you don't define what that means for each party, then each party is going to think that the other one's doing it. The both sounds collaborative, but it's a trap. It sounds reasonable, but in practice, when something goes wrong and both parties think the other one is handling it, nothing gets handled. The gap between both are responsible and owner approves the program, CMO executes and documents it. That's the difference between enforceable agreement and a dispute. The word mutually sounds great at the beginning when you sign in the contract because you want someone to manufacture your product and the CMO wants the contract, they want the job. Great. But when issues happen, mutually agreed doesn't really fly, because when your material or product is held hostage in a way, you are going to agree, and it may not be mutual because you want your product either fixed, reprocessed, or released and go to market. When it comes to law cases, it doesn't just come down to money. It can back you up in your argument, because you can back it up and say, this is what is in my technical agreement. And you have a real chance of getting the compensation for the loss of API and because your raw material failed. And one more thing worth saying about the matrix is that it needs to stay current. I've seen responsibility matrices that were accurate when they were initially created, but then they have not been updated over the years. And of course, processes changed, subcontractors change, and your matrix may need change as well. So when you're reviewing your technical agreements, you need to review your matrix. When you review your matrix, you need to review your technical agreement and make sure that your content, your written content, is aligned with your responsibility matrix. Red signals that an agreement is being weakened. So before we go to the final takeaways, I would like to give you something practical to look at when you are at that negotiating table and you are working on a new technical agreement with your CMO or your contractor. The first and most important one is when the other side wants to put the quality agreement inside the supply agreement, don't allow it to happen. Make sure that your quality agreement stays a separate document. It doesn't get mixed up with all the supply agreements, all the pricing and other matters. Then you have the resistance to name contacts or to escalation routes. This one seems minor at the beginning, but it does matter, because vague routing means information will go to whoever is most convenient at the time, rather than to the person who needs to act on it. If you have a pushback on specific timelines for deviations on and OSs, I have experienced it a number of times when the CMO or the contractor is trying to push on the timelines that we are proposing. The other side wants flexibility and you need a clock. And these two things are not compatible. And if they are resisting this, you need to ask why they are resisting that. Mutual change control language strips the owner of the final decision. And I would like to flag something here that came directly from the CMO3 situation. In that case, the absence of the three-party agreement meant there was no mechanism for any party to enforce anything on the others. Once a contractual arrangement distributes decision-making authority without preserving the owner's right to say no, you have lost a meaningful oversight over your CMOs. Then you have the resistance to audit rights, and that extends to subcontractors. If they are pushing back on this, it usually means they intend to use subcontracting as a way of putting activities beyond your reach. And this is not a small thing. It's the mechanism by which oversight gaps get created. And then you have the confidentiality language that could restrict what you share with the regulators. So no quality agreement should contain a language that will limit your ability to comply with regulatory obligations, like we had with our case, where when we looked at our clause For the audit rights and audit reports, we realized that the language was stopping us sharing the audit reports with one of the CMOs. So if you've seen one or more of these in the same negotiations, this is a signal, or should be a signal, for you to slow down and start thinking. They are not just contractual preferences, they are indications how the other party expects to behave when something goes wrong. And let me bring everything together with you with that I would like you to take away today, and that is 5 things. The first one: most agreements fail because of the vague or missing language, not because of the law. The regulations are actually quite clear about what's required. It is the writing of the quality agreement that lets people down. As appropriate, in timely manner, significant changes, mutual. These words feel safe, but they are not only flexible in one direction, and they are ambiguous. They allow a huge area for interpretation. Second, the agreement cannot transfer your GMP liability. Both parties remain independently responsible for the activities that they perform. And this matters because I've seen owners believe that signing a responsibility in a quality agreement means they no longer carry it. But they do. The agreement clarifies who does what, who is responsible for what, but it doesn't change who is accountable for when things go wrong. Third one is scope, responsibilities, change control, deviations, and audit rights are the 5 sections that cause most of the trouble. Every example I've shared today traces back to one of those 5. The CMO3 audit report situation was an audit right and a scope failure. The starting material dispute was a responsibilities failure. The undisclosed change control was a change control failure. None of them were complicated problems. They were gaps, and they had been left in the agreement. Fourth, every obligation needs a specific timeline, a named receipt, and defined consequence. If it doesn't have all 3 of them, it isn't enforceable. It's a statement of intention, which is not the same thing. And the 5th one, the agreement is only as good as the oversight program around it. The signed agreement with no audits, with no follow-throughs and no maintenance is only a decorative document. The CMO that implemented a change without notifying the owner did so in an environment where the owner was a small client, and the engagement and that level of engagement gave them that leverage. A more robust agreement, which is actively maintained, would have changed that dynamic. Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope the examples have made this feel more concrete because these situations are real. I have experienced them. They happen regularly, and they are preventable if you write your quality agreements in a clear and ambiguous manner. If today has been useful, we have a full 4-hour course that goes considerably further. It covers 5 modules in depth. It looks at the full regulatory framework, section by section walkthrough of the agreement with a weak and strong clauses example side by side. It has a deep dive into change control, deviations, OSs, and data integrity, and a hands-on workshop where you would rewrite a real clauses and build a responsibility matrix. You will also leave with some tools, a template model agreement, a responsibility matrix template, and a review checklist and a sample of clause library. These are the documents that you can use for your next agreement writing. Details for the registrations are on this slide. So I registered on our website, or contact me directly on anettajel@pqs.com. Please, again, leave any questions or comment in the comment section, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Thank you very much, and have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.